The first-class cabin falls silent as Karen loudly demands Imani's window seat. "My daughter needs it more than you," she insists, looking down at Imani's casual hoodie and sneakers with obvious judgment. What Karen doesn't know about the quiet. Black woman she's challenging will soon be revealed, and the flight attendant's unexpected response will leave everyone speechless. In the confined hierarchy of first class, appearances deceive and power shifts with altitude. When Karen demands Imani's window seat for her child, she expects compliance, not resistance. What she doesn't know, in this pressurized cabin of privilege, identity is currency, and the flight attendant's next words will change everything. Imani Johnson dragged her worn backpack through JFK's bustling Terminal 4, weaving through the Friday afternoon crowd with practiced efficiency. At 35, she'd mastered the art of being invisible when needed, a skill that had served her well in the predominantly white spaces she often navigated. Today, that invisibility felt like a blessing. Her week had been brutal. 5 days of back-to-back meetings, endless presentations, and high-stakes conversations that had left her mentally drained. The constant pressure to be on, to be perfect, to represent more than just herself had taken its toll. Now, all she wanted was to sink into her first-class seat and sleep for the 6-hour flight back to Los Angeles. She'd deliberately dressed down for the journey home. Faded jeans, well-worn Nike sneakers, and her favorite Northwestern University hoodie. Her natural hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her face was free of makeup. After days spent in professional attire, this was her way of reclaiming herself, of shedding the expectations that came with her weekday world. "Next passenger, please," called the gate agent. Imani approached the podium, sliding her boarding pass and ID across the counter. The agent glanced at her documentation, then up at her face, a flicker of surprise crossing her features before her professional demeanor returned. "Thank you, Ms. Johnson. Enjoy your flight." Imani nodded with a small smile. She was used to that momentary hesitation, the split second of recalibration when people matched her casual appearance with her first-class ticket. It happened almost every time she flew, yet another reminder of the assumptions people made based on what they saw. As she walked down the jet bridge, Imani felt the weight of the week beginning to lift. She'd earned this flight, these few precious hours of quiet before diving back into her demanding life in Los Angeles. Her phone buzzed with a notification, but she ignored it. Whatever it was could wait until Monday. The familiar scent of cabin air greeted her as she stepped onto the Boeing 777. A flight attendant stood at the entrance, warm smile firmly in place. "Welcome aboard," she said, checking Imani's boarding pass. "Right this way to first class, Ms. Johnson." The first-class cabin was half empty early in the boarding process. Imani found her window seat in the third row, 3A, her favorite position on this aircraft type, close enough to the front for quick deplaning, but not so close that she'd be disturbed by galley noise or bathroom traffic. After years of frequent travel, these small preferences had solidified into habits. She stowed her backpack in the overhead bin and settled into the plush leather seat. The familiarity of the premium cabin wrapped around her like a comfortable blanket. Though she'd never admit it aloud, these quiet moments before takeoff were sometimes the most peaceful parts of her week. As the cabin filled with the usual first-class demographic, mostly older white men in business attire, a few women in designer clothing, Imani put in her wireless earbuds and closed her eyes. She'd perfected the art of creating a private bubble in public spaces, another essential skill for survival in a world that often made women like her feel they didn't belong. The playlist she'd created specifically for flights began to play. Soft, instrumental jazz that would help her transition from the high-intensity week to the weekend ahead. Her breathing slowed as she visualized the stress of the past 5 days gradually fading away. She took a deep breath and reclined her seat slightly, letting the pre-departure bustle of the cabin fade into background noise. Just 6 more hours, then home to her condo in Santa Monica, where she could truly decompress. Maybe she'd even take tomorrow off, a rare Saturday to herself before returning to the grind on Monday. As the business class passengers started filing past toward the back of the plane, Imani pulled out her worn copy of Toni Morrison's Song of Solomon, her traditional comfort read for long flights. The book had been with her through countless journeys, its pages bearing the subtle marks of airport coffee shops and hotel rooms across the country. The flight attendants moved efficiently through the cabin, offering pre-departure beverages to the first-class passengers. When one approached her seat, Imani requested just water with lemon. She needed to stay hydrated, clear-headed for whatever the weekend might bring. Little did she know that her peaceful flight and planned weekend of quiet recovery were about to be dramatically interrupted. The peaceful pre-departure atmosphere of the first-class cabin shattered with the high-pitched wail that echoed from the jet bridge. Imani's eyes snapped open as the cacophony grew louder, a child's screams punctuated by a woman's exasperated commands. "Lily, stop it. Right now. Mommy's head is pounding." Heads turned as a harried-looking white woman in her early 40s appeared, at the cabin entrance dragging a sobbing girl of about 4 years old by the arm. The woman wore designer jeans, an expensive-looking cashmere sweater, and the unmistakable expression of someone who expected the world to accommodate her inconveniences. "Ma'am, can I help you with your bags?" offered the flight attendant who had been checking boarding passes. "Finally, someone useful," the woman huffed, thrusting 3 designer shopping bags into the attendant's hands without so much as a thank you. "My daughter's nanny got sick at the last minute, and now I'm stuck handling everything myself. It's completely unprofessional. Do you know how difficult it is to travel alone with a child?" The flight attendant, maintaining her professional smile, nodded sympathetically. "I understand. Let's get you to your seats." "I want my unicorn," the little girl screeched, stamping her foot on the cabin floor. "Lily, please," the woman hissed through clenched teeth. "Mommy already gave you 2 iPads and a new doll. The unicorn is in the checked luggage because you wouldn't let me put it in the carry-on." The child responded by throwing herself onto the floor of the aisle, kicking her legs wildly. Several passengers exchanged glances of dismay, while others strategically inserted earbuds. "Ma'am, your boarding passes," the flight attendant prompted gently. The woman rolled her eyes dramatically and dug through her Prada handbag, producing 2 first-class tickets. "I'm Karen Miller, and this is my daughter Lily. We're in 3C and 3D. I specifically requested seats together when I booked months ago, so I hope there hasn't been another mistake like last time." The flight attendant checked the boarding passes. "Everything appears to be in order, Ms. Miller. Your seats are right this way." Karen made no move to collect her screaming daughter from the floor. "Lily, get up now, or no iPad for the whole flight," she threatened, though her tone suggested this was an empty threat she'd made and retracted countless times before. The little girl's tantrum only intensified. "I hate flying. I want to go home." "Don't you think I'd rather be home too?" Karen snapped. "This is because your father insisted on having his weekend with you in California instead of just flying to New York like a normal person." Imani discreetly pressed her earbuds deeper, turning up the volume on her jazz playlist, but it was a futile effort against the escalating drama. She could feel a headache forming behind her eyes. A distinguished-looking older man in a crisp suit, seated in the first row, peered over his reading glasses at the commotion with a frown. He caught Imani's eye briefly, and they shared a moment of silent commiseration before both returned to their attempted isolation. Finally, after what felt like an eternity but was probably less than a minute, Karen bent down and whispered something in her daughter's ear. Whatever it was, it worked. Lily scrambled to her feet, suddenly docile, though her face remained tear-stained and sullen. "That's better," Karen said loudly, as if seeking praise from the other passengers for her parenting skills. "Now, let's find our seats like good travelers." As they made their way down the aisle, Karen's eyes scanned the cabin with the calculating gaze of someone assessing their competition at a social event. When she reached the third row, she stopped abruptly, her eyes narrowing as they fell on Imani. "3C and 3D, the flight attendant said, pointing to the aisle and middle seats across from Imani's window position. Karen stared at the seats, then at Imani, then back at the seats. Her lips pursed into a thin line of displeasure. "Is there a problem, Ms. Miller?" the attendant asked. "No window seat," Karen demanded, ignoring the question. "How are we supposed to enjoy the flight without a view? Lily gets anxious without being able to see outside. I apologize, but these are the seats assigned to you," the attendant explained patiently. Lily, seemingly recovered from her tantrum, peeked around her mother and pointed directly at Imani. "I want to sit by the window, Mommy." Karen's expression transformed, a calculating smile replacing her scowl as she assessed Imani's casual attire, worn backpack, and northwestern hoodie. Her gaze lingered judgmentally on Imani's sneakers before traveling back up to meet her eyes. "Perfect," Karen said, her tone shifting to one of faux friendliness. "I think we can work something out here." Imani, sensing the storm approaching, reluctantly removed one earbud, preparing herself for what was clearly coming her way. Karen Miller had identified her target. "Excuse me," Karen said, her voice dripping with manufactured politeness as she leaned into Imani's personal space. "I couldn't help but notice you have the window seat." Imani removed her remaining earbud and closed her book, her face a careful mask of neutrality. Years of navigating difficult interactions had taught her to gauge situations before responding. "Yes, that's right," she replied simply. Karen's smile tightened at the corners. "Well, my daughter and I would appreciate it if you could switch seats with us. Lily has never flown before, and she's very anxious about the trip. Being able to see out the window would make all the difference for her experience." Several nearby passengers were now watching the interaction with poorly concealed interest. "I understand," Imani said calmly, "but I specifically reserved this window seat when I booked my ticket. I fly frequently and prefer the window." Karen's eyebrows shot up, disbelief evident in her expression. "You frequently fly first class?" The emphasis made her skepticism clear. "Well, we've been assigned these interior seats, which simply won't work for us. My daughter needs to see outside." "Mommy, I want the window," Lily whined on cue, though her earlier tantrum seemed completely forgotten as she played with a sparkly unicorn charm on her mother's designer handbag. Karen placed her hand on her daughter's head in a possessive gesture. "See? She's already getting upset again. Surely you can understand how important this is for a child's first flight experience." Imani took a measured breath. "I'm sorry your daughter is anxious, but I'm not comfortable giving up my reserved seat. Perhaps the flight attendant could help you find another solution." A flash of anger crossed Karen's face before she quickly composed herself. "Listen," she said, lowering her voice to a stage whisper that several nearby passengers could still clearly hear. "We both know you probably didn't pay full price for that seat anyway. Employee discount? Some kind of diversity program?" Imani's expression remained impassive, though she felt a familiar knot form in her stomach, the same one she'd felt countless times when faced with these kinds of assumptions. "My method of payment isn't relevant," she responded evenly. "This is my assigned seat." Karen straightened up, crossing her arms. "Do you have any idea who we are?" she asked, raising her voice slightly. "My husband is a significant partner at Goldman Sachs. We spend thousands flying Delta every month." "I want the window," Lily suddenly shrieked, apparently taking her mother's raised voice as a cue to escalate. She stomped her foot hard against the premium cabin carpeting. The flight attendant who had been helping other passengers approached cautiously. "Is everything all right here?" "No, everything is not all right," Karen snapped. "We've been assigned non-window seats and my daughter has severe travel anxiety. I've asked this person if she would mind switching, and she's being completely unreasonable." The flight attendant, whose name badge read Sarah, glanced between Karen and Imani. "I apologize for any confusion, but passengers are entitled to remain in their assigned seats, especially if specifically reserved." "Well, couldn't you find her another window seat?" Karen demanded. "There must be one available." Sarah scanned the cabin diplomatically. "The flight is fully booked in first class today, Ms. Miller. All windows. Imani, trying to find a compromise, suggested, "I'd be happy to raise the window shade and let your daughter come look outside during smooth parts of the flight, if that would help." Instead of appreciating the offer, Karen's eyes narrowed with contempt. "How generous of you," she said sarcastically. "But we shouldn't have to rely on charity for what we've paid good money for." "Mommy, she doesn't want to share," Lily said, her lower lip beginning to quiver dramatically. "She's mean." "I know, sweetie," Karen replied loudly, clearly intending for everyone around to hear. "Some people just don't know how to be considerate of children." The distinguished older man in the first row turned in his seat, observing the situation with increasing interest. Several other passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some clearly sympathetic to Imani, others unsure what to make of the confrontation. "Look," Karen said, switching tactics and adopting a confidential tone as she leaned closer to Imani. "I get it. It must be exciting to sit in first class. Maybe it's a special occasion for you? But my daughter and I do this all the time, and we really need that window seat today." The implication was crystal clear. Karen couldn't imagine that Imani belonged in first class as a regular passenger. Imani felt her pulse quicken, but her expression remained composed. "I'm not switching seats," she said firmly, loud enough for those watching to hear. "I reserved 3A specifically, and that's where I'll be sitting for this flight." Karen's face hardened. "Well, we'll just see about that." She turned to her daughter and said in a carrying whisper, "Don't worry, Lily. Mommy's going to fix this situation. That seat should be yours, and I'm going to make sure you get it." She turned to scan the cabin for the flight attendant again, her expression determined. Imani put her earbuds back in, though she didn't restart her music. She needed to appear calm and unaffected, but she also needed to hear whatever came next. The battle lines had been drawn, and the 5-hour flight to Los Angeles hadn't even begun. Other passengers were settling into their seats as the confrontation between Karen and Imani continued to simmer. The boarding process was nearly complete, with flight attendants helping the last business class travelers find their places. In first class, however, all eyes kept drifting toward the third row. Karen remained standing in the aisle, deliberately blocking traffic while alternating between glaring at Imani and scanning for flight attendants. Lily had wedged herself between the seats, her small face growing increasingly red as she worked herself up for another outburst. "I don't understand why this is so difficult," Karen announced loudly, no longer addressing Imani directly but clearly performing for her audience of fellow passengers. "It's a simple request to accommodate a child. Don't airlines prioritize families anymore?" A middle-aged businessman across the aisle cleared his throat. "Ma'am, perhaps you should take your assigned seat. We'll be taking off soon." Karen swiveled toward him, eyes flashing. "Excuse me? Are you a parent? Do you have any idea what it's like traveling with an anxious child?" The man mumbled an apology and retreated behind his newspaper. "That's what I thought," Karen said triumphantly before, turning back to her daughter. "Lily, sweetie, tell everyone how much you need the window seat. Tell them how scared you are of flying." On cue, Lily's lower lip trembled. "I'm scared of flying," she stammered, though her eyes darted to her mother for approval. "I'll be really, really scared without a window. See?" Karen gestured dramatically. "This is actual child anxiety we're dealing with. Not that some people would understand the challenges of motherhood." She shot a pointed look at Imani, who continued to sit quietly, though her fingers had tightened almost imperceptibly around her book. A flight attendant approached. Not Sarah, but a younger male attendant named Jason. "Is there a problem here?" he asked professionally. Before Imani could respond, Karen pounced. "Yes, there absolutely is. My daughter and I need a window seat due to her severe anxiety, and this woman refuses to accommodate us, even though she clearly doesn't need it. She's just being difficult." Jason looked uncomfortable. "Ma'am, passengers are entitled to remain in their assigned seats." "Oh, spare me the corporate line," Karen interrupted. Mommy, I want the window now!" Lily suddenly shrieked, stomping both feet rapidly and reaching a decibel level that made several passengers wince. "See what you've caused," Karen hissed at Imani, who remained remarkably composed despite being the target of such hostility. "My daughter is going to have a complete meltdown because of your selfishness." An older woman seated in the row behind Imani leaned forward. "Dear," she said to Karen, "perhaps your daughter would feel better if you helped her settle down instead of prolonging this situation?" Karen's head whipped around. "Excuse me, are you telling me how to parent my child? The problem isn't my daughter, it's the lack of accommodation for a simple request." Her voice was rising again, matching Lily's in volume, if not pitch. Jason tried to intervene again. "Ms. Miller, we need everyone seated for departure. I'll check if there are any—" "First of all, it's Mrs. Miller," Karen corrected sharply. "And I'm not sitting anywhere until this situation is resolved. My husband donates to Senator Thompson's campaign every year, and I'm sure he'd be interested to hear how Delta treats its premium customers." During this exchange, Lily had managed to squirm between the seats and was now pressing her face against Imani's armrest, staring up at her with a mixture of curiosity and learned hostility. "My mommy says you took our seat," she declared. Imani, who had been maintaining her dignified silence, looked directly at the child. "This isn't your seat, sweetie. Your seat is right there next to your mom. Don't you dare speak to my child," Karen exploded, grabbing Lily's arm and pulling her back roughly. "Who do you think you are?" That question, loaded with implications, hung in the air between them. Imani finally spoke, her voice low but clear. "I'm a paying customer in my assigned seat, just like you should be." Karen's eyes narrowed to slits. "Oh, please, we all know how you people end up in first class. Diversity quotas and airline points from your employer. I earned my seat by actually paying for it, not by checking some box on a form." A shocked murmur ran through the cabin. The racial undertone was no longer subtle. It was explicit and ugly. The distinguished older man in the first row, who had been observing silently until now, slowly removed his reading glasses and began to rise from his seat. Before he could intervene, however, Sarah, the flight attendant, returned quickly to the scene, alerted by Jason to the escalating situation. "What seems to be the problem here?" she asked, though her expression suggested she had already heard enough. Karen immediately launched into her narrative. "This woman refuses to switch seats with my daughter, who has severe anxiety. We've been standing here for 10 minutes while she sits there smugly, completely indifferent to a child's distress. Meanwhile, your staff has been completely unhelpful." Sarah turned to Imani with a neutral expression. "Ma'am, are you comfortable in your current seat?" "Yes, I am," Imani replied calmly. "This is my assigned seat that I specifically reserved." Karen scoffed loudly. "Of course she's comfortable. She probably doesn't even know what real first-class service should be like. I bet this is her first time up here, while my family flies premium cabins exclusively." Lily, sensing an opportunity in the increasing tension, dramatically threw herself onto the floor of the aisle and began wailing at top volume. "I hate her! She's mean! I want the window!" Karen looked down at her screaming child with a mixture of embarrassment and vindication. "Now, look what's happened. My daughter is traumatized." She pulled out her phone and held it up. "I'm recording this whole incident for my social media. The world needs to see how Delta treats loyal customers while catering to others." The situation had transformed from an uncomfortable confrontation into a full-blown spectacle, with Imani caught in the center of a storm not of her making. Karen's phone remained raised, its camera lens pointed directly at Imani's face. The red recording light blinked steadily, capturing every second of the confrontation. "I want everyone to see this," Karen announced, her voice projecting to reach the entire cabin. "This is what happens when someone with an undeserved upgrade refuses to accommodate a child with anxiety. My followers will have a field day with this. Imani raised her hand slightly to block her. Sarah stepped forward, her professional demeanor firmly in place despite the escalating situation. "Ma'am, we ask that you respect the privacy of other passengers and put your phone away. Delta policy prohibits recording other customers without consent." "Delta policy?" Karen laughed dismissively. "The same policy that apparently lets anyone sit in first class these days? Look at her." She gestured contemptuously at Imani's casual attire. "Sneakers and a hoodie in premium cabin? When my family flies first class, we dress appropriately, to show respect for the experience." The implication was crystal clear to everyone watching. Karen didn't believe Imani belonged in first class based solely on her appearance and race. A few passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others watched with undisguised interest, some even taking sides with subtle nods or frowns. The cabin had become a theater, with Karen as the self-appointed ringmaster and Imani as her unwilling subject. Lily, still sprawled dramatically in the aisle, had stopped screaming momentarily to catch her breath. Sensing she'd lost her audience, she escalated by grabbing her mother's designer handbag and pulling out a metal water bottle, which she promptly hurled directly at Imani. The bottle struck Imani's shoulder before clattering to the floor. A collective gasp rippled through the cabin. "Lily!" Sarah exclaimed, quickly retrieving the bottle. "We do not throw things on the aircraft." Rather than disciplining her daughter, Karen immediately went into defensive mode. "She's just upset. This wouldn't be happening if someone wasn't being so stubborn about a simple seat switch." Imani rubbed her shoulder where the bottle had hit, maintaining her composure through visible effort. "I'd appreciate it if you'd control your daughter," she said quietly. "Control my daughter?" Karen's voice rose to a near shout. "How dare you? Criticize my parenting? You have no idea what it takes to raise a child in today's world." She turned to address the cabin at large. "Can you believe this? First, she refuses a simple request to help a child, and now she's attacking my parenting skills." The distinguished older man in the first row had enough. He stood fully, his imposing height and tailored suit commanding immediate attention. Before he could speak, however, Karen charged ahead. "Let me make something perfectly clear," she said, leaning closer to Imani, her voice dropping to a vicious stage whisper that was still clearly audible to nearby passengers. "People like you don't belong up here with us. I don't care what diversity hire program got you this seat or what government assistance paid for your ticket. This is our space that we pay for, and you're just a guest who should be grateful and accommodating." The naked racism of her statement hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Several passengers audibly gasped. A young woman across the aisle covered her mouth in shock. Even Lily seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere, her tantrum momentarily forgotten as she stared wide-eyed at her mother. Sarah's professional mask slipped for just a fraction of a second, revealing genuine alarm at how quickly the situation had deteriorated. "That's enough," the older man from the first row said, his authoritative voice cutting through the tension. "Young lady, your behavior is completely unacceptable." Karen spun toward him, momentarily thrown off by someone directly challenging her. "This doesn't concern you, sir. This is between me and—" "It concerns everyone on this aircraft when you create a hostile environment," he interrupted firmly. "And your comments are highly inappropriate." Karen's face flushed with anger. "Do you have any idea who my husband is? He's a senior partner at— I don't care if he's the President of the United States," the man replied evenly. "That doesn't give you the right to speak to another passenger that way." Sensing her mother was losing ground, Lily chose that moment to resume her performance. She scrambled to her feet, grabbed her stuffed unicorn from her mother's bag, and threw it directly at Imani's face. "I hate you! Give me my window!" She shrieked at a volume that made several nearby passengers wince and cover their ears. Imani caught the unicorn reflexively before it hit her. She held the toy carefully, looking at the child with a mixture of pity and weariness. Karen immediately seized the opportunity. Now she's keeping my daughter's toy. This is theft. I will not be silenced, Karen declared, picking up her phone again and resuming her recording. This entire incident is going straight to my lawyer, the Delta executive offices, and all my social media platforms. Black woman steals child's. Toy after refusing to give up seat? How does that headline sound? She smiled maliciously at Imani. I have over 50,000 followers, you know. By tomorrow, everyone will know exactly what kind of person you are. Imani sat perfectly still, her expression carefully controlled despite the public humiliation being heaped upon her. But those close enough could see the slight tremor in her hands as she gently placed the unicorn on the empty seat beside her, away from both Karen and Lily. The cabin had fallen completely silent except for Lily's continued wailing and Karen's increasingly vitriolic commentary. Every passenger was now fully engaged in the spectacle, their pre-flight routines forgotten as they witnessed the ugly scene unfolding before them. The situation had reached its breaking point. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom. Flight attendants, prepare for departure. Sarah, who had been watching the situation deteriorate, made a swift decision. She gestured to Jason and another flight attendant who had appeared at the front of the cabin. Ms. Miller, Sarah said firmly, we need everyone seated for takeoff. Immediately. This disruption has gone on long enough. Karen sensed the flight attendant's resolute tone and quickly pivoted her approach. Her face transformed, the rage replaced by a practiced look of maternal concern as she scooped up her still wailing daughter. "Oh, Sarah," she said, suddenly using the flight attendant's name as if they were old friends. "I'm so sorry about all this commotion. It's just that Lily has severe flight anxiety, diagnosed by a specialist, and her therapist specifically recommended a window seat for her first flight." She stroked her daughter's hair theatrically. "The doctor's note must be in my other bag. I could have my assistant email it." Lily, responding to her mother's change in tactics, dialed down her screaming to pitiful sniffles, occasionally peeking through her fingers to gauge the impact of her performance. "I understand your concern for your daughter," Sarah replied carefully, "but we have strict protocols about seating arrangements, especially when passengers have specifically reserved their seats." Karen leaned in closer, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper that was still audible to several nearby passengers. "Between us, Sarah, don't you think there might have been some mix-up with the seating? I mean, look at her." She nodded, toward Imani without making eye contact. "Does she really seem like a typical first-class passenger to you? My husband and I spend over 6 figures annually on Delta flights. We're Diamond Medallion members. Surely that counts for something." Sarah's expression remained professionally neutral, but something flashed briefly in her eyes. "Let me check our system, Ms. Miller. Perhaps there's a solution that can accommodate everyone." "Thank you," Karen said, visibly relieved and shooting a triumphant glance at Imani. "I knew someone here would understand the situation." Sarah took a few steps away and pulled out her tablet. As she scrolled through passenger information, her eyebrows rose slightly. She glanced at Imani, then back at the tablet, then up toward the distinguished older man in the first row, who gave her an almost imperceptible nod. The older man pressed the flight attendant call button. When Jason approached, the man whispered, something that made the young flight attendant's eyes widen. Jason then walked briskly to the front galley where he picked up the interphone, speaking quietly but urgently. Meanwhile, Karen had begun organizing her belongings, clearly assuming victory was imminent. "Lily, sweetie, stop crying. Mommy fixed everything. You'll have your window seat in just a minute." Lily immediately stopped crying, her tears vanishing as quickly as they had appeared. "Can I have my iPad now?" she asked, all traces of anxiety mysteriously gone. "Of course, Princess, and you can watch whatever you want once we take off. You've been such a brave girl." Karen pulled out an iPad in a bejeweled case and handed it to her daughter, who grabbed it greedily. Several passengers exchanged. Imani remained silent, her hands folded in her lap, but her spine was rigid with tension. She'd been through versions of this scenario before, different settings, different antagonists, but always the same underlying current of assumptions and prejudice. Typically, it ended with someone in authority siding with the Karen of the moment, leaving Imani to swallow her dignity along with the injustice. Sarah returned, her tablet now tucked away, her expression carefully composed. "Ms. Miller, I've consulted our system and spoken with the captain." "Excellent," Karen said, already reaching for her carry-on. "We'll just need a minute to gather our things before we switch." "I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding," Sarah said, her tone professional but firm. "There will be no seat reassignment today." Karen froze, her self-satisfied smile faltering. "What?" "The seating arrangements will remain as assigned," Sarah continued. "Ms. Johnson will keep her window seat, and you and your daughter will need to take your assigned seats immediately so we can prepare for departure." Karen's face flushed deep red. "This is unacceptable. I demand to speak to the captain. I've never been treated so poorly in all my years of flying." "The captain is aware of the situation," Sarah replied calmly, "and fully supports this decision. Now, please take your seat, or we'll need to consider other options." "Other options?" Karen repeated incredulously. "What is that supposed to mean?" Sarah maintained steady eye contact. "It means that if you cannot comply with crew member instructions, we would be within our rights to have you removed from the aircraft." A hushed silence fell over the cabin. Several passengers who had been covertly filming the confrontation on their phones continued recording, sensing a dramatic turn of events was unfolding. Karen looked around, suddenly aware that she had lost the audience's sympathy, if she'd ever had it to begin with. Her gaze landed on the older man in the first row who was watching the scene, with particular interest, occasionally making notes on a small leather-bound pad. "Fine," Karen said tightly, her jaw clenched. "Come on, Lily. We'll make do with what we've been given, though it's clear some people here don't understand the concept of customer service." As Karen roughly guided Lily into their assigned seats, Sarah gave Imani a subtle, reassuring nod before turning away. She walked toward the front of the cabin, where she engaged in a brief, hushed conversation with the senior flight attendant and glanced again at the distinguished older man, who acknowledged her with a small gesture. Karen, buckled into her seat but still fuming, leaned across the aisle toward Imani. "This isn't over," she whispered. "Not by a long shot." What Karen didn't realize was how right she was, though not in the way she imagined. The jet engines hummed to life as the aircraft pushed back from the gate. The usual pre-departure ritual had begun, flight attendants checking seatbelts, overhead compartments, and tray tables while the safety demonstration played on the screens throughout the cabin. Karen sat rigidly in her aisle seat, her posture radiating indignation as she furiously tapped on her phone, occasionally shooting venomous glances at Imani. Lily had already forgotten the window seat drama, absorbed in a cartoon on her iPad, her earlier anxiety nowhere to be seen. After the safety demonstration concluded, Sarah emerged from the forward galley with a different demeanor. Her previous professional neutrality had been replaced by an almost deferential attitude as she approached Imani's seat. "Ms. Johnson," she said warmly, "the captain wanted me to personally apologize for any inconvenience you might have experienced. During boarding, he was extremely concerned when he heard about the situation." Imani looked up, momentarily confused by this sudden change in treatment. "Oh, that's very kind of him." "Not at all," Sarah replied with a genuine smile. "It's the least we can do for one of our most valued passengers." Karen's head snapped up from her phone, her attention immediately caught by this exchange. Sarah continued, "Would you prefer the Dom Perignon or the Krug Grand Cuvée before takeoff? I know you usually enjoy the Dom, but we recently added the Krug to our premium selection based on feedback from our most distinguished travelers." Several heads turned. First-class passengers were accustomed to Of course, Ms. Johnson. Still Evian with a slice of lemon, correct? Sarah nodded knowingly. And I've already instructed the galley to prepare your usual meal preference, though Chef Daniel wanted me to tell you he's created a special entree option for this flight that he thinks you'll particularly enjoy based on your previous selections. Karen's mouth fell open slightly. She glanced around, trying to gauge if other passengers were witnessing this extraordinary level of service. They were. "Excuse me," Karen interrupted sharply. "We haven't been offered any champagne options. Is there some kind of special treatment happening here that the rest of us aren't entitled to?" Sarah turned to Karen with a polite but distinctly cooler expression. "I'll be with you momentarily, Ms. Miller. We're serving our Diamond Elite Plus members first, as per protocol." "Diamond Elite Plus?" Karen repeated incredulously. "I'm a Diamond Medallion member, and I've never heard of that tier." "It's our invitation-only, highest status level," Sarah explained with practiced patience. "Only a handful of our most loyal customers qualify." Karen's face flushed. "My husband and I fly Delta constantly. We should have been informed about this tier. This is absolutely—" "Would you prefer still or sparkling water before takeoff, Ms. Miller?" Sarah interrupted smoothly, effectively cutting off Karen's brewing tirade. The distinguished older man in the first row observed this exchange with evident satisfaction, occasionally making notes in his small leather notebook. Two other executives, seated nearby, exchanged knowing glances. "Ms. Johnson," Sarah continued, returning her attention to Imani. "The chef has also prepared those dark chocolate sea salt truffles you enjoyed on your Tokyo flight last month. I've set them aside for you." Imani's eyes widened slightly. The personal attention was becoming increasingly conspicuous, and she could feel curious stares from around the cabin. "That's very thoughtful," she managed. "Thank you." The male flight attendant, Jason, approached with a glass of water on a silver tray, complete with lemon slice. Beside it sat a handwritten note card that read, "With our sincere apologies for your boarding experience. Flight crew and Captain Williams, Karen." Craned her neck to see what was happening, her expression growing increasingly bewildered and irritated. "We've been sitting here for 10 minutes and no one has even taken our drink orders yet," she complained loudly to anyone who would listen. Sarah glanced at Karen, then back to Imani. "Ms. Johnson, the captain also wanted me to inform you that he's adjusted our flight path slightly to avoid some expected turbulence over the Rockies. He remembered from your previous flights that you prefer a smooth journey when working. This level of personalization, the captain apparently familiar with the passengers' preferences, caused a ripple of whispers throughout the first-class cabin. People were now openly staring, wondering who exactly Imani Johnson was. Additionally, Sarah continued, our ground team at LAX has already been notified of your arrival. Your usual car service has been confirmed, and they'll be waiting at the premium arrivals entrance. Karen couldn't contain herself any longer. What is going on here? She demanded loudly. Who exactly are you? She asked, staring directly at Imani. Why are you getting treated like royalty while wearing a college hoodie and sneakers? The cabin fell silent as all eyes turned to Imani. Even Lily looked up from her iPad, sensing the dramatic shift in atmosphere. Imani remained calm, though a hint of discomfort crossed her features at being the center of attention. I'm just a frequent traveler, she said quietly. Frequent traveler? Karen scoffed. They're acting like you own the airline. The older gentleman in the first row cleared his throat loudly, drawing attention. He made brief eye contact with Sarah, who nodded almost imperceptibly before addressing the cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, we're honored to have several distinguished guests with us today, Sarah announced. We appreciate your patience during our slightly delayed departure. We'll be serving pre-flight beverages throughout the cabin. Momentarily, as Sarah moved away to continue her duties, the older woman seated behind Imani leaned forward. Don't let her bother you, dear, she whispered loud enough for several people to hear. Some people can't see past their own prejudices. The rest of us are just enjoying watching her dig herself deeper." Karen glared at the woman but said nothing, suddenly aware that the tide of opinion in the cabin had shifted dramatically against her. She reached for her phone again, but the captain's voice came over the intercom announcing they were third, in line for takeoff, and all electronic devices needed to be switched to airplane mode. As the plane taxied toward the runway, Imani gazed out her window, the city lights of New York twinkling in the early evening darkness. The brief moment of peace was interrupted by Karen's harsh whisper from across the aisle. "I don't know who you are or what's happening, but this little show isn't fooling me." What Karen didn't realize was that the real show was just beginning. The aircraft reached cruising altitude, and the seatbelt sign dinged off. The first-class cabin settled into a comfortable rhythm as flight attendants began their service routine, though an undercurrent of tension remained. Most passengers were now covertly watching the drama in row 3, wondering what would happen next between Karen and the mysteriously important woman in the window seat. Imani had returned to her book, or at least appeared to be reading it, though she hadn't turned a page in several minutes. Karen alternated between whispering furiously to Lily and typing aggressively on her phone, which she'd refused to put in airplane mode despite multiple reminders from the crew. Sarah approached with the drink cart, starting her service from the front of the cabin. When she reached the distinguished older gentleman in the first row, she leaned down slightly. "Mr. Pearson, would you care for your usual Macallan 25? The man nodded with a smile. "Thank you, Sarah. And how is your son doing?" "At UCLA? Still enjoying engineering?" Sarah's face lit up with genuine pleasure. "He is, sir. Thank you for remembering." This exchange, overheard by nearby passengers, only deepened the mystery. The whispers grew more intense. Who were these people who seemed to have such personal relationships with the crew? When Sarah finally reached row 3, she served Imani first, placing a crystal glass of water with lemon on her tray table, along with a small plate of gourmet nuts arranged artfully instead of the standard ramekin other passengers received. "Chef, Daniel wanted me to let you know he's particularly proud of the cedar plank salmon tonight, Miss Johnson. He incorporated some of the suggestions you made after your flight from Seattle last month." Karen couldn't contain herself any longer. "Okay, this is ridiculous. Are you some kind of celebrity or something?" she demanded, staring at Imani. "Because I follow all the major influencers and I've never seen you before." Before Imani could respond, Mr. Pearson from the first row stood up and made his way down the aisle. He was tall and distinguished, with silver hair and an impeccably tailored suit that practically radiated authority. The entire cabin watched as he stopped precisely at row 3. "Excuse the interruption," he said, his voice carrying easily throughout the first-class cabin without seeming to raise it. "I believe some introductions are in order, as there seems to be some confusion about our fellow passengers." Karen straightened in her seat, suddenly alert. This man clearly had status, and status was something she respected. Perhaps he was on her side after all? "I'm Richard Pearson," he continued, "CEO of Delta Airlines." A collective intake of breath swept through the cabin. Karen's smug expression froze. "I make it a point to fly our routes regularly, unannounced, to experience our service as our customers do. It's the best way to understand what works and what needs improvement." He turned, slightly gesturing toward Imani with perfect courtesy. "And we're particularly fortunate today to be joined by Ms. Imani Johnson, who, as of this past Tuesday, is our new Global Director of Operations." The cabin fell into stunned silence. Karen's face drained of a color. Ms. Johnson will be overseeing all operational aspects of Delta's service across our entire global network, including our premium cabin experiences, customer service protocols, and, he paused, looking directly at Karen, our diversity and inclusion initiatives. Lily, oblivious to the bomb that had just been dropped, continued playing her game. Karen sat paralyzed, her mouth slightly open. "I was in our New York offices this week," Pearson continued pleasantly, for the executive onboarding meetings with Ms. Johnson and her team. I must say, her reputation for integrity and excellence in the industry is well-deserved. We're extremely fortunate to have her joining our leadership team." He turned more fully toward Imani. "I apologize for putting you on the spot, Imani. I know you were hoping to travel quietly today after an intense week of transition meetings, but I felt some clarity was needed given the situation that developed during boarding." Imani nodded graciously, though she appeared slightly uncomfortable with the attention. "Thank you, Richard. I appreciate it." Several passengers began to murmur among themselves, some casting accusatory glances at Karen, others looking at Imani with newfound respect and curiosity. One man in business attire actually began to applaud, and others joined in briefly. The older woman behind Imani leaned forward again. "Well, that explains a lot," she said loudly enough for half the cabin to hear. "Congratulations on your new position, dear." Karen remained frozen, her face cycling through various expressions: shock, disbelief, horror, and finally the dawning realization of just how badly she had miscalculated. The woman she had berated, insulted, and tried to humiliate was not only a legitimate first-class passenger, but literally one of the most powerful executives in the entire airline. I didn't," Karen stammered, her voice barely audible. Pearson wasn't finished. "Ms. Johnson has been one of our most valued Diamond Elite Plus members for years, with over 2 million miles flown on Delta aircraft. In fact, she's provided some of our most valuable customer feedback, which has directly improved our premium service offerings." He glanced at Lily, who had finally looked up from her iPad, sensing something significant was happening. "And Ms. Johnson recently proposed a wonderful new program to make flying more enjoyable for our younger passengers, an initiative I'm personally very excited about." A flight attendant approached with a glass of scotch for the CEO. He accepted it with a nod of thanks. "I'll return to my seat now and let you all enjoy your flight," he said. "I just wanted to ensure there were no further misunderstandings about who belongs where on this aircraft." The emphasis on those words was subtle but unmistakable. As Pearson returned to his seat, the cabin buzzed with excited whispers. Several passengers pulled out business cards, clearly hoping for an opportunity to network with Imani later in the flight. Others were frantically searching her name on their phones, reading about her impressive career trajectory in the aviation industry. Karen Miller sat completely still, the full magnitude of her error crashing down upon her like a wave. Her earlier confidence had evaporated, replaced by the horrifying awareness that she had just publicly harassed her airline's new executive leadership, on camera, witnessed by a plane full of business travelers and the CEO himself. The damage was irreparable, and everyone knew it. The revelation of Imani's identity left the first-class cabin in a state of hushed excitement. Passengers who had been surreptitiously recording the confrontation now reviewed their footage with newfound appreciation for what they'd captured, a textbook case of prejudice followed by instant karma that would likely go viral within hours. Karen sat rigidly in her seat, her complexion alternating between ghostly pale and flushed red. Her phone, which had been her weapon of choice earlier, now lay forgotten in her lap. Lily, sensing the shift in atmosphere, tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Mommy, why is everyone looking at us?" she whispered loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Shh, not now, Lily," Karen hissed, her eyes darting around the cabin as if searching for an escape route that didn't exist at 35,000 feet. Sarah approached their row again, this time with a tablet in hand and a more serious expression. Behind her stood Jason and the chief purser, a veteran flight attendant named Michael with silver stripes on his uniform cuffs. "Ms. Miller," Sarah began, her voice professional but noticeably cooler than before, "I need to speak with you regarding the events that occurred during boarding." Karen straightened, attempting to regain some composure. "Listen, I think there's been a huge misunderstanding. I had no idea who—" "This isn't about who Ms. Johnson is," Sarah interrupted firmly. "This is about your behavior toward another passenger, regardless of their identity or position. Karen blinked rapidly, clearly not expecting this approach. "We have documented several violations of Delta's passenger code of conduct," Sarah continued, gesturing to the tablet, "including verbal harassment, refusing crew member instructions, making discriminatory remarks, and encouraging your child to throw objects at another passenger. Additionally," Sarah pressed on, "you were recording another passenger without consent after being specifically asked to stop, and you refused to put your electronic device in airplane mode during takeoff, which is a violation of FAA regulations." The cabin had gone completely silent. Even Lily had stopped playing her game, watching the interaction with wide eyes. "Delta has a zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory behavior of any kind," Sarah stated. "Mr. Pearson has asked that I present you with two options." She glanced briefly at the CEO, who nodded almost imperceptibly. Karen swallowed hard. "Options?" Option 1. You and your daughter can be reseated in our economy comfort section for the remainder of this flight. We have 2 seats available there. Karen's face contorted with humiliation at the thought of being downgraded in front of everyone who had witnessed her behavior. "And option 2?" she asked weakly. "Option 2. Upon landing in Los Angeles, you will be met by our ground staff and rebooked on the next available flight back to New York at no additional charge." "You're throwing me off the plane?" Karen's voice rose an octave. "Not at all," Sarah replied calmly. "You will complete this journey to Los Angeles, but your behavior has been reported to our Passenger Relations Department, and Mr. Pearson feels it would be best if you took some time to reconsider how you interact with your fellow travelers before flying with us again." A few passengers exchanged satisfied glances. One executive in the second row actually smiled into his scotch. "This is outrageous," Karen protested, though her voice lacked its earlier conviction. "I'm a loyal Delta customer. My husband and I spend thousands—" "Your status isn't relevant in this situation, Ms. Miller," Michael, the chief purser, interjected. "Our policies apply equally to all passengers." The irony of this statement, echoing Karen's earlier assumptions about Imani, wasn't lost on the observers. A few suppressed smiles were visible around the cabin. "Mommy, did we do something bad?" Lily asked suddenly, her voice small and confused. The simple question from her daughter seemed to deflate Karen completely. For perhaps the first time, she appeared to recognize how her behavior might look through others' eyes, including her child's. "No, sweetie, just—" "Mommy made a mistake," she admitted quietly. She turned back to the flight attendants. "Will, take the economy seats," she said, her voice barely audible. Sarah nodded. "I'll arrange that now. Please gather only what you'll need for the flight. We can help move your carry-ons later." As Karen began collecting their things, Lily looked up at Imani with genuine curiosity, rather than the performed hostility she'd displayed earlier. "Are you really the boss of the airplane?" she asked innocently. Despite everything, Imani smiled gently at the child. "Something like that?" "That's cool," Lily said simply. "I'm sorry I threw my unicorn at you." The sincerity of the child's apology created a poignant moment that highlighted the contrast between Lily's natural innocence and her mother's cultivated prejudice. "It's okay," Imani replied. "It's a very nice unicorn." Karen, now standing with her purse and Lily's backpack, couldn't meet Imani's eyes. "Come on, Lily," she murmured, holding out her hand. As they prepared to move to their new seats, the older gentleman who had been seated across from Karen leaned slightly into the aisle. "You know," he said conversationally, "I've been flying this route every month for 30 years. Never once did I feel entitled to demand someone else's seat." He paused, making sure Karen was listening. "But I've certainly seen plenty of people who thought their ticket purchased more than just transportation. It purchased superiority." Karen flinched visibly at his words. "I'd say this is a valuable teaching moment," he continued, glancing meaningfully at Lily, "for everyone involved." As Sarah led Karen and Lily toward the back of the plane, a ripple of whispers followed their progress. Several passengers nodded approvingly at the resolution, while others were already texting furiously, undoubtedly sharing the story with friends and colleagues. The distinguished older woman behind Imani leaned forward one last time. "In my day," she said with quiet satisfaction, "we called that getting your comeuppance." Imani didn't respond, but at the front of the cabin, CEO Richard Pearson made a subtle gesture to Michael, who nodded and headed toward the galley. Within minutes, the flight attendants began distributing complimentary premium headphones to everyone in first class. E&E, small token of appreciation for their patience during the disruption. The rest of the first-class passengers settled in for what promised to be a much more peaceful flight than its dramatic beginning had suggested. The flight to Los Angeles continued without further incident. In the comfort of first class, passengers enjoyed their meals and entertainment, occasionally stealing glances at Imani, who had returned to her book and was clearly trying to maintain her privacy despite her newfound celebrity status. Halfway through the flight, Imani noticed a small face peering at her from between the seats several rows back, where economy comfort began. Lily Miller had escaped her mother's supervision and made her way forward, curiosity evidently overcoming any instructions to stay put. When the child realized she'd been spotted, she ducked back quickly. Imani smiled to herself and returned to her reading. A few minutes later, when Sarah passed by with the beverage cart, Imani stopped her. "Sarah, do you still have those special children's activity kits in the galley? The ones with the model planes and coloring books?" "Of course, Ms. Johnson. Would you like me to bring one?" "Yes, please. And could you deliver it to the little girl in economy comfort? Lily? With a note from me?" Sarah smiled knowingly. "Absolutely." When the kit arrived at Lily's seat, the note attached read, simply, "The clouds look different from every seat, but they're beautiful from all of them. Enjoy your flight. Imani." Karen, who had been pretending to sleep to avoid the stares of other passengers, opened her eyes to see her daughter clutching the premium children's kit that was normally reserved for young first-class passengers. She read the note over Lily's shoulder, her expression unreadable. As the plane began its descent into Los Angeles, CEO Richard Pearson made his way back to Imani's seat. "I hope the rest of your flight has been peaceful," he said, settling into the temporarily vacant aisle seat beside her. "Much better, thank you," Imani replied. "Though I'm sorry your quality control flight turned into whatever that was." Pearson chuckled. "Actually, this is exactly why I do these flights. You see things as they really are, not the sanitized version executives usually get." He lowered his voice. "Between us, your handling of that situation was impressive. Most people in your position would have pulled rank immediately." Imani shook her head. "That wouldn't have solved anything. It would have just reinforced her belief that people like me don't belong in first class unless we have special authority." Pearson nodded thoughtfully. "You know, now that you mention it, we've been discussing ways to improve the family travel experience. Any thoughts on that, given today's demonstration?" Imani glanced back toward where Lily was happily engaged with her activity kit. "Actually, yes. I've been thinking about a program that would make air travel more inclusive and educational for children." "I'm listening," Pearson said, taking out his small leather notebook. "What if we created a program where children could visit the cockpit before departure? Not just first class, any child on the aircraft. Meet the pilots, learn about how planes fly, maybe get special wings or a certificate. We could call it Children in the Clouds or something similar." Pearson was already writing. "Go on." "We could include age-appropriate activity kits with actual, educational content about aviation, geography of the route they're flying, cultural information about their destination. Make flying an adventure instead of an ordeal." "I love it," Pearson said decisively. "Would you be willing to head up the development team for this? It aligns perfectly with your new operational role and, frankly, after seeing how you handled yourself today, I can't think of anyone better." Imani smiled. I'd be honored. 6 months later, the Children in the Clouds program had become one of Delta's most successful customer experience initiatives. Travel blogs were full of praise for the educational pre-flight cockpit visits, the geography-themed activity kits, and the special attention young travelers received. Imani Johnson, now settled comfortably in her role as Global Director of Operations, was reviewing passenger feedback data in her office when her assistant announced an unexpected visitor. A man in his early 40s stood in her doorway, holding the hand of a familiar little girl. "Miss Johnson, I'm David Miller. This is my daughter, Lily. We were hoping to thank you personally." Imani recognized them immediately. "Please, come in." Lily approached shyly, clutching a now well-loved model Delta airplane. "I remembered you from the bad day," she said candidly. "Daddy and I flew yesterday, and I got to meet the pilots because of your special program." David Miller looked embarrassed but determined. "After what happened with my ex-wife on that flight, I wanted to apologize in person. Karen and I finalized our divorce 3 months ago. The incident on the plane was actually a turning point, seeing the video strangers had posted online of how she behaved." He shook his head. "It forced me to think about the examples we were setting for Lily. No apology necessary," Imani said sincerely. "I'm just glad something positive came from it." "More than you know," he said. "Lily hasn't stopped talking about becoming a pilot since your program. It changed her entire perspective on flying." Lily looked up at Imani with admiration. "Daddy says you're the boss of almost everything at the airline. Is that true?" Imani smiled. "Not everything, but enough to make sure kids like you have a great time when you fly with us." "Even in the seats at the back?" Lily asked innocently. "Especially in the seats at the back," Imani confirmed, "because the clouds look different from every seat, but they're beautiful from all of them," Lily finished, quoting from the note she'd received months ago and clearly never forgotten. As they left, Imani walked to her office window, watching planes take off and land at LAX. Sometimes the most valuable lessons came from the most difficult situations, and sometimes the person who needed to learn wasn't who you'd expect. On Delta flights across the country that day, hundreds of children were visiting cockpits, learning about aviation, and discovering the wonder of flight. Each one a small victory against the prejudice that had tried to put Imani in her place 6 months earlier. She had found her place, all right, and she was making sure everyone else could find theirs too, no matter what seat they occupied.